If I was taking all of the things I've learned in terms of training and performance and building programs and applied it all the way back to me being a beginner runner, what are the things that I would do and why would I do them? It was a great question that came through on the channel recently, so we're going to jump in and answer that right now. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Hey, welcome back to the channel. Nick here, making sports science simple. And in this quick video, we're going to talk through a great question that came through on the channel, talking about what would I do for a beginner program, specifically when we're talking about a beginner runners program. Now, I'm probably going to do a few of these videos on triathlon and cycling as well to talk about the differences I might follow in each of those. So follow along the channel, make sure you subscribe down below to keep up to date with all the videos coming on the channel soon. But in this one specifically, we're going to talk about running, and there's going to be a little bit of an assumption that I'm going to make to begin with, that someone going into using some of these principles and using some of these recommendations isn't just someone who's done absolutely nothing and now they're going to run. We're going to make the assumption you can at least go out and run for 20 or 30 minutes continuously. You do maybe 1 or 2 runs here and there each week. You don't have any structure to your training, you're keeping relatively active, and now you're trying to just channel that into a bit more of a structured training program or plan overall to maybe lead into preparation for an event down the track. And so that's the other thing we're going to leave out today, is we're going to leave out any specifics around building to a 5K or a 10K. I think those are maybe separate videos that we could do down the track. We're just looking at a general running program, someone going from doing some physical activity, keeping fit, to now I want to focus on trying to improve my running overall, but keeping things right back at basics and working as if we're working with a beginner. So the first thing I'm going to say is what I say for all of my clients, regardless if you're an absolute beginner all the way through to an elite and professional type athlete, is we need to do some form of baseline testing. We need to understand where your physiology is at. And that's where going and doing a quick field test, going and doing something like a time trial, ideally between 1.6 and 2 kilometers, is going to be a really good comparison for what we might expect from a velocity at VO2 max or a VO2 max like intensity if we were to test you in the lab. Ideally aiming for about 7 or 8 minutes absolute max in terms of time to actually complete that test. Reason for that is if we get out to 10, 12 minutes of time, that's actually going to equate to a slightly lesser intensity in most circumstances than our actual VO2 max intensity. So we just want to be careful of that. Better to go the shorter option if in doubt. But the 2 key numbers we're looking for out of a time trial like this is going for our average pace, which is going to be a pretty close equivalent of what our velocity at VO2 max is, a really key marker for prescribing our high intensity interval training. And we're also looking for our maximum heart rate in that time trial. So how high did it go? This is going to be a much better way to then estimate some training zones, particularly for our long, slow running. And ultimately, the recommendations here fall into a bit of a pattern of more of a polarized training approach, where we've got a good chunk of our training or total training load for the week is our longer, slower, continuous training, building some muscular endurance and our aerobic capacity, some positive aerobic adaptations there, lower heart rate type stuff. And about 20% of our week is going to be that really high intensity stuff where you're on the top end of our engine, with the ultimate goal being, if we're a beginner, we really just want to try and get as fit as possible and really set a really solid foundation of running so that we can channel that into wherever we want to go down the track. But once we've got some of that information from our testing, a couple of ways we need to break down the data or analyze the data is that our velocity at VO2 max, that average pace from our time trial, is really critical. We ideally then want to be able to obtain 95% of that pace. So for example, if you were to do a 2K time trial and complete it in 8 minutes, that would give you an average pace of 4 minutes per kilometer, which is about 15 kilometers per hour. If we take 15, multiply it by 0.95, that's going to give us about the conversion when we work it back, about 4 minute 10 pace, 4 minute 12 pace, very, very close to. So if we are working off, say, 95% of our VO2 max, that's going to be a really good intensity for our long interval or long hit intervals, so to speak. So why we use this is because they're really, really highly aerobic. They're a bit more extensive in terms of the aerobic side of things as well. They also don't require us to go really, really hard in terms of pace. Yes, we are working hard in the session, but it's not super fast. We're not jumping straight into almost sprinting type intensities. We're not trying to overdo it. We're really trying to have a really controlled and very consistent session and being able to replicate that intensity again and again. And that's where we find a good balance point at 95% of VO2 max. Really good starting point for things like 2 and 4 minute length intervals. Great place to develop some really positive aerobic traits, but also in a really manageable way, so you can produce that intensity, not necessarily easily, but produce that intensity time and time again throughout a session to get that stimulus as consistent as possible. I tend to recommend, like I said, 2 to 4 minute length on on efforts at 95% of max, VO2 max, with an equal walking recovery. So if you're doing 2 minutes on, it's a 2-minute walking recovery. Again, reason being, we just want to maintain the quality of those on efforts in the session. That's going to give us best bang for buck in terms of accumulating time at VO2, which ultimately is the best stimulus to get those adaptations at the top end. Ideally, if we're just starting out, building up to something like 9 to 12 minutes of effort time is probably a good starting point. So that might be 4 or 5 by 2 minute on, 2 minute offs. Total session's not going to be super long. We don't need much of a stimulus here. But once we sort of get to, if you can get to 6 by 2 minute on, 2 minute off, or even 7 by 2 minute on, 2 minute off, so 12 or 14 minutes of working time, for me, that's probably a bit of a distinguishing point between a real beginner, foundational beginnings of a program and someone who now needs to take that program to a little bit further step. So progress it quite slowly, and we want to get to a point where we can finish these sessions with the sensation of I could easily have done an extra 1 or 2 efforts in that main set. But just build it up nice and slowly. You don't have to rush this. But that's a really good set of starting point foundations for some long, high intensity intervals. Ideally, in most circumstances, somewhere between 1 to 2 of these a week is going to be perfect to really start to develop those aerobic adaptations we're looking for and set a really good quality foundation to the program. The second thing we need to look at is, well, now we need to accumulate some longer, slower distance in that training as well. To match up with the high intensity intervals, depending on how many times you want to run a week, this is where I start to, I guess, prioritize the HIIT stuff first. I'm going to take you over to Training Peaks in a moment and show you how I build out a weekly structure, but I really prioritize the HIIT in the week first. And then I go, well, do we want to run 3, 4, 5 times a week? Building that up slowly through the zone 2 is the way to go about it. So if we want to run 3 times a week, I tend to recommend ideally 2 high intensity sessions and 1 long slow. If you want to run 4 times a week, it's simple. We just add the extra long slow. If we want to run 5 times a week as a bit more of a beginner, we add an extra long slow again. So this is where I can slowly build up the volume a bit here by adding just these longer, slower, easier sessions. And that really fits in with that mold, of that periodized model we mentioned earlier. We want to have a good chunk of our training at the long, slow intensity, portion of our training at the really high intensity. That's going to develop that engine overall in a really well-rounded way. From an intensity perspective, this is where our maximum heart rate from that time trial becomes important. So now we're looking more at heart rate as our marker of intensity in the session. We need at least 20 minutes of time. So ideally a minimum of 20 minutes of continuous activity at 75 to 85% of our maximum heart rate. So take that maximum heart rate you got from your time trial, multiply that number by 0.85. Anything under that is going to be a really good option in terms of a starting point. It's going to be much better than taking 220 minus your age, then calculating a percentage heart rate zone. At least if we have a better marker of what our maximum heart rate can get to, it's going to give us a bit clearer idea. There's always going to be a bit of error, but at least it's going to refine those numbers a little bit better. So let's finish this up by jumping over to Training Peaks and having a look at how I actually put these into a weekly structure, how I maybe move some things around based on some changes, adding in runs, taking out runs. Where might you start considering adding some strength sessions in as well as you're running? So now we're over here on Training Peaks, and this is really as simple as it might be in terms of a 4 run a week structure. So as I said before, I prioritize my high intensity interval sessions first. They're where we need the most quality in the week. And so I'm going to always put those into my program first. And you can see here, I've spaced out those by at least 2 days in between. We can still go and train on those days, absolutely. Or we can still keep active, maybe do a gym session. You might do one here. But we want to have a couple of days in between to make sure that we jump into that session as fresh as possible to hit those higher intensities and keep the quality up. It's always easier to come off the back of a very easy or active recovery day into these sessions and produce that more maximal intensity rather than coming off some dead legs after a zone 2 and then going into it. So if we flip these around and did these in reverse, so zone 2 here, high intensity session, you might have that bit of dead legs, bit of fatigue, maybe some DOMs in there if the zone 2 volume's getting up there a bit more, and it might just inhibit this session. So I always like to get those HIIT sessions done as a priority first. Then you can insert your zone 2. And what I've done here is I've got a slightly shorter zone 2 as my first one midweek. For most people, that particularly beginners who might have work or other commitments, might just be a bit more practical to fit in. But also we don't need to go out and do really long runs all the time. So for example, if we're looking at, let's say this one on the weekend was 40 minutes in length. We're not going super big volume yet, but let's say you're able to do 40 minutes here of zone 2, that's sub 85% of heart rate max. This one here might only be 25 or 30 minutes. And then as they progress, this run might stay sort of 30 minutes, whereas this one builds out to 45 or 50 minutes after a couple of weeks. We don't need to have them always increasing. These don't need to increase equally. You could, but it's not necessarily going to be any more advantageous, particularly if you're just a beginner. We could get into more specificities if we had a particular case study of marathon run, etc. But that's not what we're focusing on here. Having one shorter, one longer also gives you more than anything the flexibility. If you wanted to only do 3 runs in a week, you basically just cut out this shorter one, delete it from the week, and you've got your longer one on the weekend. High intensity interval run Tuesday, Thursday. This basically means that you've got 1 day in between each run, or at least 1 to 2 days. You can see as this would roll around the week again, you get Sunday, Monday off, where you can sort of have those runs spaced out a little bit more in the week. From here, if you're 3, you add the shorter zone 2 run first. And then if you want to add a 5th run, you would add another shorter zone 2. Because again, there's no need to go out and just do really big runs and replicate this really big run again and again and again. Probably need to do that once in the week, and then a couple of shorter ones as top-ups. This would be here, the 3 runs a week would be the bare minimums I would recommend for more beginner style runners to have a really solid program or a starting program. 3 to 4 sessions is probably ideal. 1 to 2 of each is a really good split. Maybe after 4 to 6 weeks, you might consider adding in some strength sessions. If you're wondering where those sort of fit in, really they would ideally fit in on the days where you're not running. Ideally, we want to try and spread as much of the fatigue out in the week as we can. So if we had a structure like this, I would probably consider going maybe Monday as a strength day, and then maybe a Friday. We could almost do this type of thing where we move the zone 2 run to a Sunday. We could have a strength day here on the Friday as well. For most people, that's going to work pretty well. For some people, they might like to have a complete rest day. That's absolutely fine. You could have high intensity interval in the morning and then do some strength and gym type work in the afternoon. That would work pretty well. You could do it in the afternoon of the zone 2 run. I would still prioritize my running first though. So ultimately, if we are training to be a runner, that's what we need to do as a primary. Everything else would come secondary to that. So that's where I would sort of prioritize my week as well. So in terms of list of priorities, high intensity interval sessions in first. Make sure there's 1 or 2 days in between those two so you get the quality up there. The zone 2 runs, 1 longer one shorter one works well. If we are adding any extra runs to that in the week, they are zone 2 and they are shorter zone 2. And then adding in the strength can go in anywhere, but ultimately think about prioritizing your running first, then add in the strength because it's a supplement or a complement to the running work that we are doing. So hopefully you got a bit out of me explaining what I would do for a beginner runner. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below if you thought about some of these when you first started your running, or if you are a beginner runner, let me know down below. I'm going to do a couple of these videos on some different areas. So what would I do as a beginner for triathlon? Because I know that's where a lot of people get a bit confused with different sports added into the mix as well. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel to keep an eye out for those if you are interested. Otherwise, always happy to hear your thoughts and questions in the comments for things that are related to this video today, but also other things you want to see on the channel. As I mentioned right at the beginning, this video was sparked from a great question that came through in the comment section. So let me know your questions down below. Always happy to engage in that discussion and create videos that are really specific to the people who are watching them. So hopefully you got a bit out of this one today. Enjoyed making this one and looking forward to making a couple more similar to this. But otherwise, I'm going to leave it there for today and we'll see you in the next one.